Now, after the Civil War was no longer, there were no longer any questions about the national government in terms of whether or not it remained supreme. The end of the Civil War proved that the national government was the supreme government and that a state could not secede. But the debate over the division of powers progressed through two more stages. Now, dual federalism views that the states and the national government are co-equal. They are sovereign powers that remain within their own spheres. And you can think of this like a cake, a layered cake. Many saw the prevailing model as the return to states' rights that had existed before the war. The Supreme Court had been on the wrong side of the Civil War conflict and lost its legitimacy for an entire generation. Now, you may recall from American history, there were several Supreme Court cases that were handed down in the years just before the Civil War that upheld slavery. One of the most famous being the Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court wrote in law that a black man had no rights that a white man was obligated to respect. And this really impacted the way the court was viewed after the Civil War had ended. Now, as the court began to regain its powers over time, it used those powers to define and defend this philosophy, keeping the federal government out of what was considered to be any type of local matter. So the court sort of went the opposite way and decided that it didn't want to exert too much power, too much authority. Cooperative federalism views that states and the national government work jointly to solve common problems. You can think of this like a marble cake, where you see the two different flavors of cake kind of muddled together. But this also expands the role of the national government in response to crises. So, in response to the economic situation of the Great Depression, which was disastrous, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration implemented a series of New Deal programs or social welfare programs and new finance laws. And the Supreme Court initially blocked those initiatives because they felt that this was the government really exerting power over the state. But by 1937, there had been so much political pressure that the court really ceased to interfere with the national government's legislation under the Commerce Clause. Roosevelt's programs typically were funded by the federal government, but they were administered by the states and the local governments. And this created a cooperative framework that most hoped would continue beyond this particular situation. Here we see Franklin Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945. And in this image here, he is chatting with two Georgia farmers. And Roosevelt's approach to addressing the effects of the Great Depression was overwhelmingly popular, even by people who had historically been very much anti-government and very much against any form of kind of federal welfare. The reality of the Depression was so vast that people really had to accept help from any government entity that was willing to help them. Many of those initiatives initially were relatively controversial because they'd never been tried. So something for you to start to think about is, how did the Great Depression change the political beliefs of ordinary Americans? And are there any other major events that have changed the political beliefs of a nation. Arguments over the allocation of powers continued. Conservatives tend to support states' rights, while liberals tend to favor large federal governments. And the difference here really centers on which entity people believe are most capable in preserving and protecting people, but also in implementing necessary changes. Under Presidents Nixon and Reagan, the Republican Party championed what was called de-evolution, the transfer of powers from the national government back to the state and the local government. But later, these party divisions concerning federalism became less pronounced. So some examples are Democrat Bill Clinton, who signed legislation giving states control over the welfare programs. President Clinton recognized that states would be much more equipped to manage that money and kind of carry out welfare in the individual states. But on the other hand, George W. Bush, who was a Republican president, signed legislation that increased federal government control over education. That piece of legislation, of course, you might be familiar with, was called the No Child Left Behind Act. Beginning in 2009, conservatives began to rediscover this concept of states' rights. Remember, back in 2001, we had 9/11, and as a result of that, we saw a lot of extension of control from the federal government over the daily lives of people in terms of increasing in military funding and spending. We saw that No Child Left Behind Act. We saw 10 years, 8 to 10 years there of war being carried out in the Middle East. And by 2009, conservatives began to push back and return kind of to the states' rights mindset. Now, part of this was because Democrats were in control at the national level. In 2008, Democrats had taken not only the executive, the presidency with the election of Barack Obama, but Democrats held the majority in both the House and the Senate. Now, one way of implementing federalism is through a grant. This form of federal funding increased significantly through the 20th century. So there are several ways in which the government is able to exist and kind of carry out various forms of legislation. And there are several different types of grants. Categorical grants are federal funds that go to states or local governments for specific projects or programs. Categories. By the 1980s, the largest five accounted for more than half of federal revenue spending. Those five are Medicaid, highway construction, unemployment benefits, housing assistance, and welfare. Now, more than half of the money that is being spent by Congress goes to those five areas by the 1980s. They are a popular way to persuade states to operate various federal programs. Now, all such grants come with requirements for the states that receive them, allowing the national government substantial control over those states. So an example is giving highway funds only to a state that might raise the drinking age, or granting highway funds to a state that wants to do something else that the federal government would like, perhaps raise taxes in a certain area, maybe build a community center or um, low-income housing, those kinds of things. So the federal government can say, we will give you X amount of dollars for such and such, and then the federal government will sort of decide how the state can implement a lot of that funding. There are also block grants, which are federal funds to state and local governments for broad functional areas. This allows governors and mayors a lot more leeway in deciding how to spend them. So example here is that giving block grants to every state for various welfare programs, but then allowing the individual states to decide how much they will allocate and how they will spend that money. There are also federal mandates, and federal mandates are just requirements that force the states and the municipalities to comply with certain rules that or take certain actions. Sometimes a mandate implements a costly policy without providing funds to cover those costs. So one interesting thing here is that some states had passed various laws that would restrict same-sex couples from getting married. And as a result of that, the federal government might issue a mandate that says a state can't have a certain amount of money as long as they have laws on their books and in their state constitutions that restrict the rights of American citizens to live under the 14th Amendment, of course, which is that due process amendment. Now, typically we see trends in American history. We may see several years where there's a strong states' rights view. We may see years where there's a strong push towards a very strong central government. Usually it's connected to what's going on in the economy and what's going on in terms of foreign affairs and international issues. Now, the Supreme Court has the final word on where the line is drawn between federal and state powers, and its interpretation has changed over the years, justifying the national government's widespread authority since the 1930s, but imposing limits back in the 1990s. So it's difficult to predict how the court might rule in various cases. Now, remember that Supreme Court appointments are for life. So a president wants to be able to appoint justices to the Supreme Court that he or she believes will be able to sort of uphold either a conservative or a liberal view of that Constitution. And that kind of accounts for that change. You may have a period where the majority of the justices are conservative or liberal. Right now in 2020, we actually have a relatively balanced Supreme Court in terms of the numbers that are considered conservative and liberal. And we actually have a couple who have historically been liberal who have voted conservative on cases, and a few who have been historically conservative and have voted kind of liberal or ruled liberal on some decisions. So Supreme Courts can be somewhat unpredictable. Since the mid-1990s, the Supreme Court has tended to have a greater weight in states' rights. In the United States v. Lopez case, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had exceeded its authority in passing the Gun-Free School Zones Act, marking the first time in 60 years that it had actually limited the national government's powers under the Commerce Clause. Other rulings have restricted national authority and bolstered state authority under the 10th Amendment. Remember, the 10th Amendment says that any right or privilege that isn't specifically outlined as belonging to the federal government ultimately belongs to the state governments. This invalidated provisions for background checks for gun purchases, and the 11th Amendment provided immunity from lawsuits over violations of rights that were established by federal laws. The court has tended to favor states' rights in many decisions, but it has backed the federal government at times. Examples are favoring the federal government over California regarding its medical marijuana law, but favoring states' rights in upholding Oregon's death with dignity law. Many issues will face the Supreme Court involving the constitutionality of high-profile issues. So some examples of that were states that objected to the Obama administration's Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or that Obamacare and the individual mandate that requires Americans to make a purchase. Additionally, there were individual states that had banned same-sex marriage. Ultimately, the Supreme Court did side on upholding the individual mandate and did decide on banning on upholding the lower court's decision that said individual states could not actually ban same-sex marriage. So again, something for you to start thinking about. This is an older image, but this is former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer, and she was at the center of a lot of controversy in 2010 over a state law that restricted the rights of illegal immigrants. The United States Supreme Court did overturn parts of the law in 2012. Your question, something to think about is it okay for state governments to adopt special state policies on immigration, keeping in mind that illegal immigration is illegal, and as such, if a person is an illegal immigrant, they do not receive the same immunities and protections under the Constitution. So how should states handle those issues and those people? A couple of things to think about as we are wrapping up this chapter. Why do concerns about immigration differ from state to state? Is this an economic or a social issue? What does the Supreme Court say about federalism and immigration? And then, do modern Americans want a melting pot culture? That brings us to the end of Chapter 3, American Federalism. Thanks.